Hello and welcome to the Decyfr GP Paddock Pass, brought to you by Decyfr Sport, a series of interviews and insights into Formula One's rapid rise in popularity in the United States of America. My name's Dan Lawrence, and joining me to discuss all things USF1 fandom is Bryson Sullivan, who is one third of the delightful Tech Heads F1 podcast, and he's also a resident F1 tech expert on Twitter. So we'll be chatting all about how Bryson became an F1 fan, how he got into F1 content creation. We'll discuss F1's boom in America. We'll look back on the events in Baku from this past weekend. And we'll also look ahead to the Miami Grand Prix, which is the first of 3 US GPs on this year's calendar. But enough from me. Let's get talking to Bryson here. So first of all, Bryson, hello, how are you?
I'm doing quite well. Thank you for having me. Of course, I have to defer the title of F1 tech expert to people much more experienced than me. I do have a background in engineering and training in it, and I love all of the technical aspects of Formula One. Perhaps my greatest strength is just talking about it too much, and anyone who cares to listen, I'm happy to talk about it more.
I think that's perfect. I don't think you can talk about it too much. I think it's something that needs to be talked about loads. I think it's like a never-ending treasure trove, isn't it? F1 tech. But yeah, second of all, how did you become an F1 fan? I guess, and then also how did that become from being a fan to being a podcast co-host?
What's so interesting about my F1 journey is that it is entirely unintentional, is sort of accidental. I was working with some people in a summer job, and they were incredibly enthusiastic Mexican Formula One fans. And they said, "Come on, let's go to this race. Let's go to this race." And I said, "Why would I want to do that? Why would I want to just watch cars go around in circles?" Little did I know. But they managed to actually drag me to a race one fine Sunday afternoon, and even though there weren't as many cars racing on the track as there should have been, you might be able to infer which race that was. Uh, the performance of the cars wasn't diminished at all. And immediately it was the technology, it was the engineering that really drew me to the sport to begin with. And that passion hasn't diminished at all over time.
Wonderful, and I think that race you're referring to is obviously Indy in 2005. For those who don't know, back then, there were two tyre suppliers. You had Michelin, Bridgestone. Michelin brought a tyre compound that didn't quite cope well with the famous banking of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and tyres kept sort of having very significant blowouts, and then it resulted in the Michelin runners pulling out, and you just had 6 cars for the Grand Prix. But yeah,
Yeah, and just to answer the second part of your question, how did I go into the role of becoming a podcast host? Ultimately, that was not really intentional either. Ultimately, we found ourselves having some fantastic discussions on Twitter and other places, Twitter Spaces, and talking about tire warm up and diffuser tunnels and downforce and drag and all these wonderful things. And we really just wanted a way to document the conversations that we were already having. And so some of the people that are in my space, my co-host, Dr. Obbs and Molly Oxner, are also engineer trained, huge F1 fans, as well as other motorsports. And we just wanted an opportunity to kind of focus on technical elements specifically and perhaps bridge the gap between extreme, precise technical detail and what the average person might be able to understand. So my podcast is very much an edutainment podcast, I'll say. There aren't many spicy takes on the podcast, but it is very helpful for people to wade into the world of F1 technology.
yeah, and I think that's perfect. I think listening to your podcast as well, you can. I think it's really good. You say like it bridges that gap of you being a fan of a sport, but then also if you're knowing and understanding what makes that sport tick, I think that makes your sort of your love for it grow and become even more sort of significant. And talking of sort of like significant growth and stuff like that, I guess you're an example, and your co-hosts are an example, and the Twitter spaces that you engage in are an example of F1's rapid rise in popularity in the US, which has sort of seen a really significant boom in recent years. And you could maybe ever since sort of Liberty Media took over the commercial rights of the sport in 2017. 2022, for instance, I saw a Forbes article had a record TV viewership across ESPN, ESPN2, and ABC. It was 1.21 million average viewers per race. Brand involvement, I think, according to Autosport, US brand involvement with F1's gone, I think, 220% increase in the last 5 years. It's crazy numbers. So obviously, like everyone in the US is sort of getting on board with Formula One. To you, Bryson, what would you say are the main factors behind that in recent years?
I know the easy or easy-ish explanation is to attribute this purely to Drive to Survive and the dynamic and incredible racing seasons that happened to be captured by that series in the previous couple of years. That's definitely a big part of it, but it's actually only one facet of several things that Liberty Media is doing. And in particular, their willingness to open up Formula One on the social media side, to not take down instantly every video that even mentions the word Formula One, to actually make clips available every race weekend. That is a huge part of increasing Formula One's profile. As you may know, the previous owner of Formula One, Bernie Ecclestone, had a very different mentality about who the target audience was for Formula One, and he had a kind of a myopic view of how many people could actually love this sport. And this is something that I tell everyone about Formula One. There's something that's lost in translation about just seeing cars go around on the TV. Wow, that's cool. Everyone understands the concept of an F1 car. It's got wings, an engine, it makes downforce, but very few people really understand the energy involved and the speed involved in these cars. And adding more clips and making the series more open to a wider audience helps to convey what that's actually like. And that also results in more viewers watching the races and ultimately more people going to the races in person.
I think that's pretty much a perfect answer. That transition from Bernie's sort of, I guess, old world view, putting it mildly and succinctly, of how Formula One should operate, and obviously Liberty Media taking it really truly into the 21st century and sort of embracing everyone stateside and all over the world who want to get engaged in the sport. Obviously, you touched on Drive to Survive there as well. Just keen to sort of get your sort of insights on that, or how you feel about Drive to Survive. It's been around for 5 seasons now. Looks like it's here to stay long term. Um, I think Stefano Domenicali, in an Autosport article, the F1 CEO Stefano Domenicali, he directly credits it as being the reason for F1's growth in the US, so, which is obviously up for debate. What would you say Drive to Survive does well, and what do you think it could do with improving if it is here to stick around long term?
I have a background in aeronautics and aerospace, and there's a parallel here that I often bring up that people understand when I mention it. Drive to Survive is basically like the Top Gun of motorsports. And what I mean by that is Top Gun, the original, 1986 film Top Gun, was an incredible display of aviation and, military prowess and all these wonderful things. But I can tell you from a technical side, it is not an accurate depiction of naval aviation. Okay.
Yep.
It's just not. And by the same token, Drive to Survive, definitely in the early seasons, but to a degree in the later seasons as well, is not an accurate reflection of what actually happens on a race weekend,
Mm.
either chronologically or content wise. There are some let's just say inauthentic narratives that are in the race weekend, and also some inauthentic, sound design and things like that.
Yeah.
But I really don't have a problem with that because I really view it as a stepping stone to get people more involved in the sport.
Mm.
If you have no idea what Formula One is about, why it's so dangerous, why it's so exciting and thrilling as this sort of circus that travels the world and races cars at 300 kilometers per hour, if that gets you even marginally interested in it, it allows you to open the door to several other incredible levels of detail that you can explore at your own leisure. So if you want to learn more about driver strategies, or you want to learn more about the physical demands of driving a Formula One car, or you want to learn more about the technology, as you mentioned with the Tech Heads podcast, that's there for you to explore. And you can do so based on your, emotional reaction to perhaps I don't want to say a dumbed down version of what
Mm.
Formula One is like, but perhaps a more cinematic version of it. So I don't really have any problem with that. I don't have any problem with new fans coming into the sport who are not, traditionalists. And I know oftentimes I've heard personal stories of people who have been quizzed on the spot, who was the Formula One champion in 1982, and they have never even heard of Keke Rosberg.
Yeah.
But that's an arbitrary test that really is just a manifestation of gatekeeping. So really what I'm interested in is spreading this appreciation for Formula One as widely as possible, and Drive to Survive is a way to do that.
Yeah, essentially, it's a gateway, isn't it? I think you get your hook with Drive to Survive, and then, as you said, tech heads or F1 TV or whatever like that. That's where you then go. You jump off from Drive to Survive to those points. And I guess another thing Drive to Survive's been a gateway into is the sort of behind the doors of Haas. They seem to have been a sort of popular team with the Drive to Survive camera crew, especially Gunter Steiner, the team principal, has become some sort of like cult hero figure because of the show. Um, they sort of dub themselves as America's F1 team. You've got Gene Haas, the owner, but in terms of sort of their operation, they have their bases in the UK and a technical department in Italy next door to Ferrari. So, would you say they're an important part of American F1 fan culture, or would you say that maybe they're just sort of a part of just F1 as a whole, and sort of F1 fans in the US don't particularly draw themselves to Haas; they go for the whole thing, the whole sport.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, at least on the F1 side, as far as personnel, or are there Americans in F1 in general? All of them don't work for Haas, right? To begin with, they work in Mercedes, they work in Ferrari and Red Bull and other places. So Americans on the actual functional side of F1 are diffused, throughout the entire sport. But as far as Haas being, heavily identified with the American fan base, I mean, that's definitely a part of it. They are, by their position, the de facto American team. And if your primary interest is in American F1 as opposed to F1 specifically, you would tend to gravitate towards that team. Now, to be clear, I'm not going to say they're the modern version of minority F1, right? In
Mm,
the current version, they've definitely been on the rise and improving their stature year on year. I still blame William Story at Rich Energy for half of their problems, probably more than half of them. But they're going in a good track, and it definitely is improving the profile of American, motorsports figures in F1 having Haas there. I think that will only improve with more teams on the grid and with more representation from a driver's side and also from a technical side and engineers and things like that. But Haas has a unique place that I wouldn't really replace with any other team, and they have some very talented people working there, even if their results don't show it in the short term.
yeah, exactly. And then obviously you touched on sort of new teams coming into the sport as well. There is one sort of hopeful F1 team that have been quite vocal in recent times, and that's Andretti, or Andretti Cadillac, as they're now known. Michael Andretti sort of running the show there. And he's been quite vocal about his intentions to want to join the F1 grid. But there's been a sort of a little bit of pushback from within the paddock, sort of teams not wanting to share prize money or, this, that, or the other, or just being quite protective. One, do you think that's really fair? And two, would you say that Andretti would be a benefit to the sport when if and when they do come in, and would they be a benefit to the USF1 fans?
In reverse order, the addition of Andretti or any other new team, wholesale new team, would absolutely be a benefit to F1 globally, but also to the United States specifically. I think one of the things that makes F1 so complicated and so unique is there are only 10 teams and there are only two cars per team. So that means that there's an extreme minority of people who are interested in Formula One that can actually work in Formula One, right? There's an extremely small group of people that actually work there. And so one of the major things that having Andretti as a potential entry to the team to the grid will add is that it adds more landing places for up and coming drivers, team managers, strategists, manufacturing people. There's an entire ecosystem of personnel behind the scenes that actually is involved in bringing these cars to the track. Adding a new team will only improve to that as far as getting people to actually work in F1. One of the biggest problems that we have, though, is, as you said, we're undergoing a massive Formula One boom. The
Mm,
valuation of the sport and by proxy, the teams has increased massively. And the rules that were set aside, 1 year ago, 2 year ago, for 2 years ago, for what we expect new teams to actually abide by to be able to join the grid, even that is considered to be an undervaluation. And so I can understand the pushback that the teams have by trying to protect their interest and preventing new people from coming in. This is categorically different from new management coming in and
mm.
reworking with an existing team, because in principle that doesn't actually, cut into your dividends. It's the process of adding a new team that makes it so much more complicated. I can't fault teams for looking after their best interests. What I
Mm,
would want is I don't want any sort of conflation of reaction to having a new team come in and that profit sharing question, and then this question of it being an American team, and specifically a very competitive American team.
mm,
Haas is a great enterprise. They have a great team, and as said before, they're trending in the right direction, but they don't have the same pedigree or cachet that an Andretti or a Penske or another team would have if they were to join the grid. And I do feel like there is some degree of the current teams questioning if they really want to compete with another competitive team. So I hope this is all worked out in the end. Personally, I would very much like to see Andretti on the grid. I know people who are not directly involved with the team, but are very close to it. And they're very serious about joining the Formula One grid. And I wish them all the success in the world.
yeah, I think it'd be a welcome addition. I think also if you add Cadillac to the mix, they've got a very exciting um, World Endurance and IMSA as well program with their new prototype, which sounds amazing as well as being a very exciting development. That's for a different time because obviously we're talking about Formula One. But go check out the Cadillac LMDH. Just Google what it sounds like because you won't be disappointed. Um, but moving on from sort of American F1 growth, and before we touch on Miami, let's take a little look back on recent history, very recent history. Baku, we just had the Azerbaijan Grand Prix this weekend, and it was significant for a number of reasons. One being it was the first sprint weekend of the year and showcased the new sprint structure. So whereas before we just had one qualifying session setting the grid for Saturday's sprint, and then the result of the sprint setting the grid for Sunday's Grand Prix, we've now got two qualifying sessions. Friday's Grand Prix qualifying setting the grid for Sunday's race, and then we had the Saturday morning sprint shootout setting the grid for the sprint. Do you think that the new structure worked, or do you think it needs further tweaking for the five remaining sprints of the year?
I'm not sure we're in a position to be able to actually tweak it for the 5 remaining events of the year because that requires sign off by all the teams to get money in place and other details, materials wise, and spare parts. But I do think that the format needs tweaking. Believe it or not, what I think Formula One has been doing has been slowly orbiting the ideal solution of a sprint race. They've been very hesitant to do what is, really what I think a sprint race is about, which is about action. They have
Mm,
been unwilling to fully commit to that conceit. And what I'm sort of indirectly implying is that what we should actually do for a sprint race is reverse the top 10 in the grid. And traditionalists will say that's not real racing. No, that's not what Formula One is about. But the reality is that the purpose of a sprint race, yes, it's to get points and to compete in a competition, but it's also to have unexpected results. It's to
yeah,
introduce jeopardy, have unexpected winners. And believe it or not, Formula 2 has kind of converged on the ideal version of this format quite a long time ago. And I think it's just Formula One gradually and slowly getting to that standard. They may get there next year. So I do think that sprint races definitely have a potential to be interesting, but I think that Formula One as a sport and we as fans need to allow them to fully commit to it without actually, getting upset because as we said, the race in Baku, even though I found it very interesting because I'm watching, sector times and deltas, and I can see that this fight is playing out corner by corner to the average person whose entertainment is proportional to overtakes, that was a boring race. It was a
mm,
boring sprint race. It was a boring, actual race. And if you want to make that a little bit more interesting, my suggestion is to follow what F2 does. You don't have to do it, precisely. There's still enough time in the day to actually add a third session on Friday or on Saturday, because with the current sprint format, we've actually lost a little bit of on track running time, which some drivers have noted. But fundamentally, I do think that there's value in the sprint, but it still needs some tweaks, and it requires a bit of courage on the
mm.
part of the organizers to be able to commit to this concept. And even if fans don't think they want this, semi-artificial racing, I think it is the ultimate solution.
Yeah, I think I'm inclined to agree, and I think they've already made that significant step, haven't they? They've rejigged things quite significantly already this year, so I think that's a step in the right direction. And then, yeah, as you say, Formula Two with the reverse grid, it does add that extra bit of excitement and jeopardy. So I think maybe that is the perfect solution. Maybe we need to get that out there even more. But yeah, also another significant thing from Baku, I guess, as well as the sprint, would be Sergio Perez, who had a very good weekend. Um, I think he's kind of cemented his status as king of street circuits in Formula One. Well, he won the sprint and he won the Grand Prix, the first ever repeat winner of the Azerbaijan Grand Prix as well. All but one of his Grand Prix wins have come on street circuits, I believe. So I'm asking from a tech sort of viewpoint and then from a general fan viewpoint, why is he so good at street circuits? And now he's only 6 points behind his teammate Max Verstappen in the championship. Do you think he's a genuine title contender?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's amazing about Sergio Perez is it is true that he is a sort of a street circuit master, but we have to kind of look back and see why is he so good at that. One of the things that street circuits tend to feature a lot of is slow 90-degree corners that are traction limited on the exit, require a very careful throttle application. Sergio Perez is better than almost anybody at rear limited circuits that require a lot of care to hold on to the rear tires lap after lap. As you saw, Baku has like 4 or 5 90-degree turns in order. Three of them are left turns right away. But he's extraordinarily good at tire preservation, and it's not so much the type of tire preservation associated with limiting slip in a high speed corner and minimizing understeer and that kind of tire preservation as at a high speed. It's much more of a low speed, very hard on the entry, carrying a lot of speed mid corner, and then very, very judicious on the throttle application on the exits. So if you were to actually go back and look at sector by sector in Baku when Max was chasing down Checo, where was Checo fastest? It's in that first sector. Almost always, that first sector was just blindingly fast lap after lap, and Max couldn't quite catch that. But then in the middle part of the lap, and then towards the back end in the castle section, Max was actually the quicker one because he does a little bit better in some of the high speed corners. Well-known analyst Peter Windsor is very good at analyzing driver styles. I'd highly recommend listening to his analysis on the topic as well. But as it happens, Sergio Perez is very good in those types of tracks. Um, the question that you asked is whether or not Sergio Perez is a genuine title contender, and we don't really know. We
Mm,
know that his base skill level, combined with his affinity for street tracks and rear limited circuits, can give him, the one up on Max Verstappen under certain situations. Yes, he did have a fortunate safety car for him, but I actually think he was gunning for the win anyway. Miami coming up, even though it is classically, classified as a street circuit, it's actually far less of a traditional street circuit than Baku
mm,
is. It has more high speed corners, and the slow speeds are not quite as slow. They're not quite as many 90-degree, left turns or right turns. Although there are some slow bits in the back there towards turn 11, 12, 16,
yeah,
the back part of the circuit. But Miami is going to be sort of a middle ground to kind of see if Sergio Perez can hang with Max Verstappen for a bit. But when we start getting to the more traditional circuits, Imola, Spain, a few other ones, that's going to be a situation where Max is going to be extremely powerful. And so that's where we're really going to be able to tell how Sergio Perez can do. But, make no mistake, Sergio Perez realizes that the opportunity to drive what is clearly the fastest car on the grid comes very, very rarely. Even when he
yeah,
was at McLaren for that one year, he didn't have the best car on the grid. And so, if there was any possibility that in his life that he could actually win a championship, this is it. He's not going to back off. He's not going to back down. If he can actually put a lap together and fight for a win, he's going to do so, and he should be expected to do so. I mean, many people like to write him off as a clear number two driver, but he has dreams too. He
yeah,
has aspirations and hopes and desires, and who are we to say he can't do that? So I think fundamentally he's going to have to demonstrate on some of the more traditional circuits that he can win. But Max Verstappen is not who he is, by accident. His greatest or his strongest suit is actually his race pace. Qualifying, he's pretty good, but can be
mm,
beaten by the likes of Charles Leclerc and others. But his race pace is deadly.
yeah.
He's very good at stringing together, metronomic fast laps, over and over and over again. He's a very difficult driver to beat. So I wish him luck. It should make for an entertaining rest of the season.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's vital in terms of when you have seasons like this, when you have a dominant car like the RB19, to have a sort of a teammate in that dominant car who can challenge. Because I think you look at sort of back when Senna and Prost were in the MP44, that car was miles quicker than everybody else. But Prost and Senna were each other's equal, so you had an exciting, compelling Formula One season and narrative for a few years. Obviously, with all the added drama going on with them behind the scenes as well. So I think the more Perez can challenge Max, I think the better for everyone watching F1. And obviously, the next chapter of that is going to be Miami this weekend. The second time we've been to Miami. It's debuted last year. It's one of three Grand Prix on the calendar in the United States, along with Austin, and then the sort of semi-return of Vegas, if you count the Caesars Palace Grand Prix of the 1980s, which is
We
dubious
try
one.
hard. We try hard to forget that.
Yeah, it's
Actually,
a blot, isn't it, on the USF1 copybook? I think, but this one should hopefully be a bit more exciting going down the strip. So obviously, you went to Miami last year, and what would you say makes Miami sort of unique amongst the three US races we've got this year, and what could be sort of improved upon Miami to make this year's event sort of better than last year's? I think there was the issues with track surface offline and stuff like that.
Yeah, the reintroduction of the United States market to F1 has been quite interesting. It's quite clear that Formula One and the United States are quite fond of one another, but they haven't quite figured each other out fully yet. We obviously want to have races in the United States, and Miami is a beautiful city. It's actually where I'm from originally, so I have a lot of affinity for the city. Seeing Formula One cars race in anger in Miami is something that I've been hoping to see for a very long time. The situation where the track is actually located is actually far more ideal than another circuit like, Circuit of the Americas in Austin, which is in the middle of nowhere, very difficult to access, very difficult to get phone service. The Miami International Autodrome at the Hard Rock Stadium it's more towards Fort Lauderdale almost than Miami proper, but it's still in a developed area. The access to the circuit is much easier, so that part of it is actually quite excellent. The experience of being there was fantastic. So many fan activities, so many, displays of motorsport memorabilia and local auto clubs. It was just a wonderful experience. And people don't realize is the Hard Rock Stadium, this massive stadium that the NFL uses for the Dolphins, is open to general admission people, general access people. So it's actually in an elevated position with fantastic viewing angles to actually see the cars, and the acoustics of the cars with the engine noises bouncing off the walls is really quite special. I don't think people really quite realize. The thing that it needs to improve on is the price profile. Now,
Yeah.
to be clear, if you have unspeakable amounts of disposable income and you want to spend tens of thousands of dollars for a 3-day experience, go do that to your heart's content. I have no problem with the ceiling of what the
Mm,
pricing is for the event. What I'm more concerned with is the median price for
mm,
tickets and the floor price. What's the minimum cost of entry for a random person to be able to actually get into the race and see these cars up close? Because as I said, my first exposure to Formula One wasn't on TV. It wasn't reading an article. It was actually being at the track. It was such a visceral and formative experience for me. And I did it kind of on a whim. I didn't really
mm,
save up tons of money to go. I just went on a random weekend. I fear that the next generation of Formula One fans will not have that same opportunity to go on a random weekend to see an F1 race because they're priced out of it for whatever reason. And so granted, supply and demand, the ticket is worth what people will pay for it, and people seem to be paying for it. So I don't really have anything negative to say about that. But just try to meet people a little bit more halfway, just to make a pricing profile that allows more everyday people to get access to see these incredible machines. It's a very interesting circuit. They did redo the pavement for this particular race, even though the drivers hated it last year. It did make for some interesting overtakes, even though
yeah.
half of them weren't displayed on the live feed. But no, the race is it's far more it has far more potential than many naysayers might realize. The threat of a Florida shower is always going to be there. It actually rained last year and people didn't realize it in between sessions. So keep that in mind. And anytime you have a new track, teams have to figure out new setups, new balance, new driver profiles. They have to figure out how to optimize their performance. It can lead to more variability than you might get at another track like you know, Barcelona. So I'm very excited, looking forward to the race this weekend. It'll be the first time there for several drivers, Logan Sargent's among them, but he's going to be having a great time, I imagine.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you mentioned Logan Sargent there. It's not only is it your home Grand Prix, it's his, being a Florida man himself, and I think it's quite an important thing we could segue into now. Logan being the first American F1 driver since Alexander Rossi in the back end of 2015. Sort of how significant do you see Sargent's presence in F1 being for sort of US's rise in popularity with Formula One? And how would you rate Sargent's season so far?
I think it's very important. I mean, as you said, there are some Formula One fans who are just fans of Formula One in total. And I'm one of them. But there are fans who don't necessarily require a driver from their home country to be in the race in order to support it. However, it doesn't hurt. And
Mm,
if you have someone that you can focus on and someone you can cheer for, that can benefit the overall, user experience, fan experience of either being at the track or watching it on TV. It definitely adds to the profile of Formula One. It's also important to realize that anytime you have a new driver and they're experiencing these incredibly physical cars for the first time, that's something that can relate to people that haven't driven before. One of the biggest sins of Formula One is people think, "Oh, I could do that. I could drive a Formula One car. That's what's so hard about that." And they don't understand non-inertial reference frames. They don't understand acceleration. They don't understand how physical it is. And when you have a new driver, it's resting your neck. You can kind of help convey that to people. But as far as Logan himself, he had some difficult things to deal with. Had some crashes in Jeddah and had an unfortunate incident at the end of the very chaotic Australian GP, which we
yeah.
can skip for right now. But in terms of how he's learning, the feedback he's giving to the team, his comparison to Alex Albon, he's been good. He's
Mm,
been he's been learning as he goes along. And again, these are arguably some of the hardest cars, Formula One cars to drive ever, with their complicated brake-by-wire systems, the energy recovery systems, and carbon brakes, and the 18-inch wheels and tires, which can be more difficult to work with than the previous 13-inch tires that we had in the past. So he's learning very much as he goes along, and I think we haven't really figured out what his sweet spot track is, but driving a Formula One is a complicated thing, and you'd all assume that, or you might assume that all drivers just drive the car, either you're fast or you're slow, and that's the end of the story. But as we were talking about with Sergio Perez, some drivers, their natural abilities and their natural tendencies tend to make them faster on certain tracks. Logan is still fresh enough in this world that we don't know what his, center of the bullseye track is, but maybe it's Miami, maybe it's Imola, we don't know. I
mhm.
think there's going to be a big result coming for the team, and I think they've been fighting for points or a point at basically
Yeah.
every weekend. And I think he probably just needs to get one or two big results under his belt to really convince himself that yes, he belongs here. He's part of this circus, this global circus we call Formula One, and he can contribute. So overall, I'm very happy with what he's been doing. I'm happy with the leadership in the team, with James Vowles going over from Mercedes to Williams. I think that's a point of stability and a point of experience that he can feed off of to really get a better feel for how he's doing. And then Alex Albon is a great teammate to have. He's no slouch in any sense. Yes, he had some difficulties at Red Bull, but Adrian Newey designed some fantastically fast but difficult to drive cars. The Williams is much more in line with a more neutral design philosophy, and Alex has done well with them. So I'm looking forward to see what Logan can do as well.
Yeah. I think also another thing in terms of sort of assessing what Logan Sargent has done so far in Formula One and will continue to do is track dependent, as you said. And we've had really wildly different circuits for each of the venues, like each of the rounds so far, like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Baku. They couldn't all be more different from one another, really. And then Miami again. So it may be until we get to, like, as you say, Imola, Spain, the same with Sergio against Max, until we get into that sort of the European section of the calendar that we really find out how Logan's going to do, and we could predict where he'll end up. And talking of predictions, I want your Miami predictions now. So if you, I guess it's hard to tell without watching practice or anything like that. You can never really know, sort of before the weekend's kicked off. But at the moment, who would you put your money on for taking sort of the pole, taking the win, being on the podium, and who do you reckon will be the surprise package at Miami this weekend?
Mercedes is not really going to be featuring in that prediction for a while there. They do tend to do better at front limited circuits rather than rear limited ones. So Miami could be a little bit better for them than Baku was. But we're really waiting for their major upgrade package in Imola to come before we really start judging how the rest of their season could play out. It would be easy to say that Red Bull would be the winners, and they probably will be. But make no mistake, Ferrari made a big step
Yeah.
in the past couple of races. It was clearly made evident in this past weekend's race. But they actually made a big step in Melbourne, and I think it was obscured a bit by Charles Leclerc's first lap incident and Carlos Sainz, trying to get past and having some traffic issues, but they've made a big step, and it seems to be a mechanical one that helps them to preserve their tires a bit better. So Ferrari has already demonstrated, even now, they have the pace to get pole positions again, which wasn't the case before. They can get pole positions again, but the question is, can they hold on to the tires long enough to be able to fight against Red Bull for a Grand Prix distance? That's the problem. Red
Mm,
Bull's car is maybe only a couple of tenths faster than the next fastest car in qualifying, but it's closer to half a second, 7/10 of a second a lap faster over the course of a race stint in a high degradation circuit situation. So that's the thing that the entire rest of the grid is trying to compete with. I think that the resurfacing of the Miami circuit might factor into this. We don't know if it's going to accelerate the deg or if it's going to decelerate it, but it will be a factor. I predict that Sergio Perez will win the race just because he's been building a lot of momentum and he's in a punchy attitude. I think that there will be a Ferrari on the podium as the third place team, but I can't tell if it's going to be Leclerc or Sainz. By Sainz's own admission, he had a lot of difficulty being comfortable
mm.
on the brakes in Baku and feeling the limit reliably. I don't think he'll have those same issues in Miami. So I do predict that both Red Bulls will be on the podium, but I also predict that a Ferrari will as well. And I'm going to say Signs because, why not?
Cool. I like it. I like it. And surprise package, would you say, is that science or is that a different team?
I think that let's go outside of the top three teams, or
Yep.
perhaps even four teams for a moment. Aston Martin and Mercedes are going to be fighting it out. It seems to go back and forth each
Mm.
race weekend. I think McLaren's actually going to factor much more prominently in Miami than they did in Baku. McLaren has a serious drag problem as the Mercedes W14 has, but they did take a step forward
Yeah.
in Baku. It seemed to be worth 2/10, maybe 3/10 on that particular circuit configuration. But there's not a lot of high speed corners in Baku, and I think that's actually where it's going to benefit McLaren quite a lot more. So I predict that the best of the rest, if we'll say, might actually be McLaren this upcoming weekend, as opposed to Williams or some other team. So that's my surprise.
Sweet. Wonderful. Well, I think that brings us to an end of our discussion. Thank you very much, Bryson, for all your sort of insights and your predictions there for Miami. And let's see if they pan out and end up being correct. And then obviously, thank you to everyone listening and watching. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion as we talk all things USF1 fandom here on Decyfr GP Paddock Pass. And I hope you enjoy Miami this weekend. Where will you be watching from? What are your predictions? You can let us know at Decyfr GP on all of our socials. Just follow us at Decyfr GP on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And also make sure you follow Bryson, who's been our wonderful guest today. Bryson, where can people find you and where can they find your podcasts?
I can be found at handle Natural Paradigm, primarily on Twitter, offering lukewarm takes. I'll say, mostly on Twitter, but I'm also on Instagram. And yes, I'm the co-host of the Tech Heads F1 podcast, which is on Spotify, Apple. We have a Twitter page and Instagram page as well, where we do some short form tech bites. Those are the primary places where you can find us. But thank you again for having me on. As I said before, I always love an opportunity to talk about F1, and I will do it whenever I can. If I can get, one or two more people excited about the sport, even half as much as myself and some of my associates, I think we've done a good thing.
Perfect. That's a great way to end. Let's get more people excited in Formula One. Thank you very much, Bryson. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.